блядь! Ебать! Нахуй, блядь!
In Sumy, northeast Ukraine, an Iranian-designed Shahed drone launched by Russia strikes buildings on Tuesday, injuring 9. While international attention has been focused on the Middle East, the war in Ukraine has rumbled on. On Wednesday, a Russian drone hit this kindergarten in Kharkiv. Witnesses describe scenes of panic as parents and emergency services battled through flames to dig their children out of the rubble. 48 were evacuated, at least one person was killed and 6 were injured. A place of learning and nurturing turned into the scene of a war crime.
I dropped my bags and I ran towards it. First I saw the burnt car, then I saw the direct hit, the roof burning, everything inside burning. I made my way through to the rescuers to get a child. You know, every mother would jump and pull her child out of a fire.
In Washington, after President Donald Trump rode back from providing Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles following his call with Moscow last week, his patience with President Putin is waning. Proposed talks between the pair in Hungary in the next fortnight are off, and Trump announced his first sanctions on Russia since returning to power in January.
I think that they'll certainly have an impact. They're massive sanctions. It's sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push, hopefully he'll become reasonable, and hopefully Zelensky will be reasonable too. You know, it takes two to tango, as they say.
Rosneft and Lukoil are the two largest oil companies in Russia and account for nearly half of their crude oil exports. All assets belonging to them in the US will be frozen, and US companies and individuals will be barred from doing business with them. The measures also include sanctions against dozens of subsidiaries of the companies. The US is also threatening secondary sanctions on foreign financial institutions that do business with Rosneft and Lukoil, which could include banks that facilitate sales of Russian oil in China, India and Turkey. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, who met with Trump on Wednesday, welcomed the move.
The Russian economy is in a difficult situation. We know we have these long lines into gasoline stations all over Russia at the moment. We know that the French president and others in Europe stepped up when it comes to the shadow fleet. And of course we have seen the pressure by the American president on some European countries to stop buying oil. So all of this is having an impact.
President Zelensky, meeting European leaders in Brussels today, praised the decision. The EU has also announced a 19th package of sanctions, which includes a ban on Russian liquefied natural gas imports.
19th package is very important, and of European leaders, of EU, but American sanctions are also very important. And this is a good signal to other countries in the world to join the sanctions. You know that not only energy, we need shadow fleet, etc., and continue until Putin will stop this war.
Zelensky has also been buoyed by an agreement to buy up to 150 Gripen fighter jets from Sweden, paid for using frozen Russian assets in Western nations. The jets, which can land and take off on civilian roads, are thought to be more practical for Ukrainian battlefield conditions. Ukrainian forces have been targeting Russian oil refineries and energy infrastructure in recent months in an attempt to hurt its economy. Overnight, they struck the massive Ryazan refinery, one of Russia's biggest, leaving it ablaze. Trump's sanctions will have a wider impact, with oil prices on international markets rising today by as much as 5%. As this conflict enters its fourth winter, diplomacy may be frozen, but Western leaders are still hot on continuing to back the Ukrainian cause through whatever means they have.
Well, joining us now is Stephen Dalziel, a Russia analyst, journalist and author. Stephen, thank you for speaking to us. How significant are these new sanctions announced by Trump?
They will be significant if they're applied properly. This has been the problem all along, ever since the Russians started the full-scale invasion in February 2022, and the European Union, the West, the Americans slapped what looked like very powerful sanctions on Russia, but Russia has been getting round them one way and another. There are companies who are simply going behind the back of governments and doing deals with Russia. Russia is still selling vast amounts of oil and gas to countries like China and India. So it's a question, to forgive the cliche, but the devil really is in the detail. And in this case, the detail is, will Russia be able to avoid doing backroom deals to get round these sanctions? So we have to wait and see, I'm afraid.
And the sanctions will possibly affect subsidiary companies and financial institutions that facilitate these deals. Do you think any of this might put off China and India from buying Russian oil?
To be honest, I don't think so. Certainly not China. India is playing a careful game between the two sides. It says, well, we need Russian oil, and even if they have to pay these huge tariffs that President Trump has slapped on them, then they will. But it's very interesting, actually, that there's a story just appeared today in the Washington Post. It's not to do with oil and gas, but it's to do with Russia getting round sanctions. And it's about Russia building a detection system for foreign submarines around its northern bases, Archangel and Murmansk up in the north of Russia. And this has been done with a great deal of unsuspecting Western help. They set up a shell company in Cyprus called, I have it here, Mostrello Commercial Limited, and companies who thought they were, fair enough, dealing with a genuine Western company have in fact been dealing with Russia, and Russia has set up this very sensitive system so that any Western submarine crossing into Russian waters will be detected. And this is just a very good example of how, in all innocence, sometimes Western companies can get caught out and they find that they're actually breaking sanctions without meaning to. So there are those who do it when they're not supposed to, and there are those who do it accidentally. It's all very well, as I say, applying these sanctions, but how they're going to be monitored is crucial.
And going into the fourth winter of the war in Ukraine, what is the state of Russia's economy as far as we can tell?
Russia has now a total war economy. At least 40% of GDP is going on the war. And it's all tied in also with the propaganda for many years. Russia, for many years now, even before Putin's time, it goes back to Soviet times, Russians have been taught that the West is the enemy. The longer Putin has been there, and he's been there 25 years now, a quarter of a century, he really has drilled into people through constant propaganda that the West is the enemy. This war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about the West. It's about Russia's future existence. And as a result of all this, Russians are prepared to accept hardship in a way that many people in the West would not be.
The EU has also announced a 19th package of sanctions. Resolve in Brussels seems strong, but are these measures actually up to much?
Well, as far as the sanctions are concerned, it's the same issue as with the American ones. It all depends on how carefully they're monitored and whether Russia can get around them. But the greater issue in the EU, of course, in Europe, is that these are sovereign states and they don't always agree with each other. They don't always speak with one voice. We have some examples, for example, in Hungary, where they are very pro-Russia. So that is one issue as well. But far more important for Europe, and given that we can't really trust Donald Trump these days because he flip-flops one way and then the other, who knows what he'll say tomorrow, whether he'll support Russia or Ukraine. So the Europeans really need to step up in terms of supplying weaponry to Ukraine. That's really the only way I can see that any end can come to this war in the near future.
Well, speaking of military aid, Putin did manage to stop Ukraine getting long-range Tomahawk missiles last week, but Trump has pulled the plug on talks in Hungary. How well is Putin managing Trump 2.0?
Well, it's a very good question, and it really must be difficult for Putin himself extraordinarily, because he doesn't know which way Trump's going to go. He thought after Alaska that he had Trump in his pocket, and indeed many of us thought that it looked that way. But then, of course, before Trump spoke at the United Nations a few weeks ago, the last person to speak into his ear was President Zelensky of Ukraine, and he came out with a much more pro-Ukrainian attitude. Now we've seemed to have gone from is he going to send Tomahawk missiles? He speaks to Putin. He says, no, I'm not. Now he's come out with these sanctions against Russia. President Putin must be as confused as anyone about what President Trump is going to do. But that is a worry for the West too, because we really can't rely on President Trump.
And finally, Russian voters are set to go to the polls next year. Presidential election results are usually somewhat of a foregone conclusion in the country, but there have been some protests recently in Putin's home city of St. Petersburg. Is his position in any danger with the mounting death toll and now the economic issues?
Probably not. This again, it shows that Russia is. We mustn't look at Russia as a what we might consider a normal Western country. There is no real effect of public opinion because, particularly in recent years, particularly since the start of the war, Putin really has clamped down on opposition, on any media that doesn't agree with him. It's now very difficult even to ring and speak to Russians on WhatsApp. He's really clamping down on social media as well. So most Russians don't have access to any other opinion than the official one that is broadcast at them all day long on television and on their own social media. So he's not, in a sense, threatened as a Western leader might be threatened, yet at the same time, he does have this fear and I would say his biggest fear of all is not actually the West. It's what the Russians call bunt, which is a spontaneous uprising from below. It's really what happened in 1917 when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. It was a small group of organized people who overthrew the Tsar and then later that year carried out the Bolshevik Revolution. And so it's again, it's this question, don't look at Russia and think we're looking at a normal Western nation. We're not. It has a long history of not liking the West. It has now a leader who is very much ingrained in that idea, but he will make every possibility not only to fix the elections, but to make sure that Russians don't get a fair crack of the whip and don't see what an alternative view might be.